Answered after a long silence in a calm, matter-of-fact way. She left us. She doesn't love us anymore. Those were the words that shattered my world when I was 8 years old. My name is Sabria Lewis, and this is my story. I recall looking through my parents' drawers for a tangible explanation of what had happened. My father was an officer in the Algerian army, and at first I was convinced that it was the military's fault. They are causing trouble because my mother is French, I thought. For days I looked for documents to document my theory, and although I eventually gave up searching, my mother's sudden disappearance remained a mystery. My father was humiliated that my mother had left him, and I was the pawn he would use in their bitter divorce. Although I was separated from my mother for many years, I didn't live with my father either, because he was often gone on military missions. So I lived with his sister, my paternal grandparents, my father's second wife, and then his third, and then back to my aunts again. I learned to pack up my things and leave at the drop of a hat, and more importantly, how to avoid growing attached to any particular place. All this moving around sent me a clear message. I was a burden. I was not wanted. I lived with my aunt the longest. Her husband was very abusive. He beat his son often and for the smallest infractions. The beatings were so severe that my cousin, covered with belt buckle marks, could barely stand up to go to school the next day. My mother had disappeared seemingly forever, and my father had abandoned me to a place where threats abounded. I was angry and lived in a state of constant fear and anxiety. At least I was allowed to go to school, not a given for a girl in Algeria. My education was due to the influence of my grandfather, the patriarch of the family, a religious and illiterate man. All major family decisions were his to make, and he made sure that all his 12 children and countless grandchildren got an education, including the girls. Nonetheless, I was aware that this freedom was not afforded to every girl my age. And as I grew older, my vision of the world was not that it was filled with promise and opportunity, but rather that it was a dangerous obstacle course leading to a dead end. As puberty approached, the doors began to close. I was no longer allowed to play outside with the other children. I was not to see my classmates outside of school. I was not to go out of the house for any reason unless accompanied by a male relative. And I was not to speak to any male that I was not related to. I was followed, and my every move was monitored to make sure that I could be trusted. I was spending my weekends and summers at home learning to be a good and obedient wife. The biggest threat to my schooling, which I didn't see coming, was the arranged marriage starting at age 15. As families came to ask my grandfather for my hand in marriage for their sons whom I knew nothing about, I realized that I had no way out. I knew that the men in my family completely controlled my life, and I had no choice but to abide by their decisions. Understanding that I had no say in what my life was to be, I gave up all hope and fell into a deep depression. I prayed for help and guidance. None came, or at least not then. And then one day, as I was coming out of the all-girls school I attended, I saw my mother standing at the gate. She had contacted my grandfather and received his permission to take me away for the weekend. Finally, I had the chance to ask all the questions I had bottled up for years. She had admitted she hadn't expected my father to keep me in Algeria, and although he shuffled me from home to home, she had tracked me down. She had asked the French embassy to help, but they refused to get involved. She had written to me all those years, but my family had withheld her letters. As I listened to her, I realized that she had never stopped looking for me. My hope for a better life was reborn that weekend. I did not know when or how, but I knew that someday I would leave Algeria. As our weekend together drew to a close, I begged her to take me to Paris with her, but she knew it was impossible without my father's signature on an official form. A few years passed before I was able to act on my decision, but when I graduated from high school, I announced that I was moving to Paris. To my father, my leaving meant that I was choosing my mother over him, another blow to his pride. My father and I argued heatedly, but in the end, he signed the necessary forms that would allow me to leave Algeria. Before he had the chance to change his mind, I was gone, although I knew that our relationship would not survive my departure. To say that Paris was a huge culture shock is an understatement. Here I was, a shy, sheltered girl who was afraid of her own shadow, who had never made a decision of her own, thrown into a modern Western capital with all the freedoms that we take for granted. I was overwhelmed, to say the least. The rules I had learned to live by no longer applied. Women wore short skirts, sat at cafes, drank alcohol, smoked, held hands with men, and went to nightclubs. Clearly, they were not from respectable families like I was. Needless to say, I had to be retrained. I recall my mother encouraging me to go to the movies alone, and convinced that I never again would be given such freedom, I stayed for 2 movies in a row. For months, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that my relatives were still having me followed. I was lost in a world I did not comprehend. I even considered returning to Algeria. I did not like living there, but at least I knew and understood the rules. I sought help and guidance from religion, and that search took me from Islam to Christianity and ultimately to Judaism, where I found peace and beliefs that matched mine. I no longer felt lost and alone, but my search for a place to call home was not over. A few years later, in an effort to improve my English, I had the opportunity to move to the United States. I got a job in Austin, living with a family, and they introduced me to their cousin Kevin, who is now my husband. His life and his optimism were so different from my life and my worldview. That year in America showed me that this was a land that spoke to something deep inside me. Coming to America on my own gave me the confidence to experience what freedom was all about. Although I returned to France when my visa expired, I moved back to New York City soon thereafter and reconnected with Kevin. Although I would not sign up for a repeat of my childhood experiences, I have to admit that they have helped me appreciate all that is in my life today. God has bestowed great blessings upon me. I have been happily married to a wonderful man for almost 25 years. I chose him carefully and made sure to let him know ahead of time that if he were ever to beat me, I would leave and never come back. I can't adequately describe the look on his face during that conversation. But trust me, it was priceless. He clearly thought I was out of my mind. Today, I am a strong woman. I am in charge of my life. I chose my husband. I chose my religion. And not least of all, I chose to live in this country and make it my home. I have been blessed with freedoms I could never have dreamed of in the culture I grew up in. I am allowed to do as I please without anyone's permission or constant supervision. I delight in the knowledge that our 2 children have inherited freedoms and a sense of optimism rather than the doubts and burdens with which I was raised. I am very proud that I became an American citizen. I am always moved to tears when all of us stand together with our hands on our hearts to sing our national anthem. I cherish our flag and the freedoms our Constitution affords us, especially the freedom of speech, maybe because I didn't have a voice growing up. As I leave you today, let me contrast 2 vignettes for you. Vignette 1. When I was a young woman, I was timid and scared. I was not trusted by my relatives, and I lived in a culture where I was inherently suspect as an unmarried teen, not allowed to go out, not allowed to speak my mind. Vignette 2. Our daughter accidentally registered to vote using our address in Houston instead of hers in Dallas, where she goes to graduate school. So she got in her car, drove to Houston to exercise her right, her freedom to vote. For her sake, as well as mine, I am so grateful that we live in the United States of America.
We are each responsible for keeping America on course. Are we there yet? The children ask. We know the answer. We pursue justice, but still have a way to go. We celebrate